I'm very glad to be at Wabash. I haven't ever been here before. I have a Wabash connection. My great-great-uncle, Uncle Fred Rabb, graduated here in 1905. He was a young uncle of my grandmother, but we always called him Uncle Fred, and I knew him in the 1940s and 50s. So that's one connection, and then I'm a Hoosier on my mother's side, my grandmother's side. My people come from Attica and Williamsport. By the way, I have a speech defect, and you can either grow accustomed to it or run screaming from the room. It doesn't matter to me. And here's an important family connection with Indiana. The song "On the Banks of the Wabash," which if you don't know, you ought to know, you ought to learn. "Round my Indiana homestead stand the cornfields," blah, blah. "On the banks of the Wabash far away" was written by Paul Dressler, Theodore Dreiser's brother, somewhat surprisingly, and one of the Hoosier poets and novelists. And Paul Dressler, now I got to get this right, was my great-great-grandmother's lover. So I have deep Indiana roots. It's a wise child who knows his father. So I kind of wonder if maybe Paul put some genes into the pool. I don't know. Let's not speculate. What I'd like to tell you about is this obsession of mine in the last 10 years. 3 books, wonderful books. You can buy them at Amazon. They make excellent Christmas presents. Your mother will be delighted to get Bourgeois Virtues, Ethics for an Age of Commerce. Beautiful. Oh, God, I love it. But that's volume 1. Volume 2 is Bourgeois Dignity. Why, and hear what it says, why economics can't explain the modern world. Now, I'm an economist. What does an economist go around saying economics can't explain the modern world? Then volume 3, see, 1, 2, 3, it's going to be a boxed set like Harry Potter. If I earn 1/100th of her royalties, I'll die rich as well as happy. Volume 3, which I just completed, I'm working on polishing the footnotes as we speak. In fact, if I pause and go work on the footnotes, you won't mind. Is called Bourgeois, what's it called? Bourgeois Equality. How betterment became ethical, 1600 to 1848, and then suspect. So you'll notice that bourgeois is in all the titles. Bourgeois Virtues, Bourgeois Dignity, Bourgeois Equality. And the point, one of the underlying points is to show that the middle class, the bourgeoisie, we call them in French, but they were called that in English in the early 18th century, before the phrase middle class was popular, are good for us. Now, everyone here is middle class, bourgeois, by educational attainment. You know, you may think it's scandalous to be bourgeois, but you are, so you might as well get accustomed to it. And one point of this series of books, well, it started out being 1 book, then it was going to be 4, then it was going to be 6. In a vulgar combination of Latin and Greek, I was going to call it a sexology and sell a lot of copies. But that didn't meet the test of bourgeois virtue. That was a really dumb idea. So it's only 3. It's a regular old trilogy. But one of the purposes is to bring the bourgeoisie back to dignity. Now you might think, what's the problem here? Middle-class people are highly esteemed in the United States, but they're not esteemed by the artists and the intellectuals and the journalists and some of the professors. There's an anti-capitalist disease out there which has been working since 1848 to undermine middle-class society. Now, this is dangerous. The 20th century shows how dangerous it is, because nationalism and socialism, and if you don't like that, National Socialism, are the curses of the modern world. And they're anti-bourgeois, all of them are. So my claim, that's my kind of, I don't know, that's the emotional steam behind what I'm doing with these books. That's why I'm in the business of writing long books about the middle class and about economic growth and so on. But I got another thing I'm trying to do. I call it humanomics. Economics with the humans left in. Now I know your teachers here leave the humans in, but sometimes economics doesn't leave the humans in. It becomes very abstract and foolish, actually, kind of stupid. So I'm trying to do a kind of economics that takes advantage of what we know from literature, from plays, from the Bible, from the Holy Quran, from whatever, our human side, what we know as human beings, not just what we observe from far away about human beings. Okay, so this humanomics, well, I have a friend named Herbert Gintis, an economist. Long time ago, about 10 years ago, I was presenting the first volume of this to the American Economic Association, and Herb said, well, Deirdre, you got to have a killer app. You got to have a killer app. Now, everyone here knows what a killer app is. All the young people do. The old people have no idea what it means. Too bad for you. You got to have a killer app. You got to have something that really shows that this humanomics idea is really worth having from a scientific point of view. Well, Herb, I've got a killer app. I've discovered it slowly over the last 10 years, and it's this. I can explain modern economic growth, and other people can't. I can explain why we're so darn rich, and other people, other economists and historians can't. Now that's, if I'm right, and I hope to God I am, I think I am, then that's a real accomplishment for this humanomics stuff. And here's the argument. Look, here's a short history of the human race, Homo sapiens, us. Let's start back in, let's see now. Let's make this 200,000 years ago, which is the first emergence of our race. There's only one human race, it's us. And let's make this table $0 per day. Now you can't get along on $0 per day. And let's make this little distance here. Now watch, just that much. That's $3 a day. And now I'm going to start history. And my finger has a magical power. It can do scientific diagrams just by itself. It's like, you know, pianist, a great pianist. It's in your fingers. So anyway, here we go. $3 a day, $3 a day, $3 a day. $3 a day, nothing much happening, 100,000, 150,000, blah, blah, blah. About here, we get the invention of agriculture. By the way, agriculture does not originate in the ancient Near East. This is the old way of talking, a Eurocentric way of talking. Actually, agriculture was invented completely independently in 9 separate parts of the world. Central America, Peru, New Guinea, Sub-Saharan Africa, Saharan Africa before it became a desert. All over the place, people invented agriculture. And you'd think, well, that would bring us up above $3 a day. Imagine living on $3 a day. It's not hard to imagine because many people do right at this moment. Many people in very poor countries sleep on the streets, cold or not, and have very little to eat and no clothing to speak of, and they're just very, very poor. $3 a day. You can just barely subsist at that level, but you're not doing very well. Well, you'd think that agriculture would make everyone better off. Well, it doesn't. Because of Malthusian arguments, namely, when suddenly things are better, you've got agriculture. Oh, hey, this is great. Let's have some agriculture. The trouble is you get more people. More children survive. The women are more fertile. You get more people. You get diminishing returns, as we know from economics. And so it goes back to $3 a day. So here, we're over here. Agriculture doesn't help permanently. It's a good thing, agriculture is, because it allows the growth of cities. But the way you get the cities is by rich people taking away the agricultural output from poor people. It's called rent, or taxes, or tithes to the church. Anyway, the landlords, the rulers, and the priests get the surplus of the society that it had, and the rest of us, our ancestors, I don't see any descendants of the crowned heads of the world here. My people were peasants not long ago. I suppose yours were too. Poor people don't benefit, ordinary people don't. Now, look what happens. Here we're going along, around 1800, here's what happens. Now, you have to watch this very carefully, because this is, see, I told you this is my scientific finger. It goes like this. Now, watch. Yeah, the sound effect is very important. That is, in places like France or Japan, income per head goes from $3 a day to $100 a day in 2 centuries. $100 a day. In the United States, it's about $130 a day. In Norway, where some of my ancestors come from, it's up at $140 a day. In Ireland, where most of my ancestors come from, Ireland was unspeakably poor in 1800. And now Ireland, despite the crisis you may have heard of in its housing industry, Ireland now has one of the highest per capita incomes in the world. Ireland. That's what's happened in the last 2 centuries. And now it's starting to happen in China and India. And it's going to transform the world. It's not a threat to us. It's not a bad thing. Now it's starting to happen in Sub-Saharan Africa. This is wonderful news. And the wonderful news is that the can happen anywhere. It's not, only English people can do it, or you have to be European to make it work. No, that's a lot of crap. You could be Asian, we discovered, in the great Asian tigers of Taiwan and South Korea. South Korea in 1953 was flat on its back. It had just had a great war up and down the peninsula. It was ruined. Its average income was the same as Somalia in 1953. Now look at it. It's up to $80 a day instead of $1 a day, which is what it was in 1953. $1 a day is not even survivable. $3 a day, maybe. It's not a very nice way to live. But the way we live, the way everyone in this room lives, is a tremendous improvement. And observe what I'm saying. It's completely unique. It didn't happen in, I don't know, the glory of Greece and the grandeur of Rome. It didn't happen in the Song dynasty in China in the 11th, 12th, 13th century, early 13th century, which was a great time of Chinese creativity. It didn't happen in 15th century Florence or 5th century Athens. Those were all times of industrial and intellectual and cultural revolution, and were wonderful episodes in human history. All of them were. But they didn't have this amazing effect, which I call the Great Enrichment. They improved things. 5th century Athens was richer than 6th century Athens, put it that way. But it wasn't a factor of 30. Listen to what I'm saying, dears. 30. Now, go back to your 5th grade math. What percentage change is a factor of 30? Let's see now. You take the 30 and you subtract the 1, which is the base. You start from, say 1, and you factor of 30. 30 times 2,900%, right? A 2,900% increase over 1. 1 to 30. Got it? 2,900%. Whereas these great eras of creativity, including the Industrial Revolution of the 18th century, but the Song dynasty and so forth, might have had an increase of 100%. But look, 100% versus 2,900%. It's as the physicists and engineers say, it's 2 orders of magnitude higher. It's a completely different order of magnitude of economic growth. And it's transformed the world. You know, your ancestors didn't go to college. Maybe some of them went to college, but very few. If you go back far enough, no one's ancestors went to college. And you don't have to go too far back when your ancestors were crowded into huts with a large family and cows in the back, and it was a lousy life. Smallpox, constant waterborne diseases. Look, in Rome, half of the children in ancient Rome, glorious ancient Rome, half of the born children didn't make it to age 15. Half. Now think of your brothers and sisters. Think of half of them just dying before age 15. And that's the $3 a day life. And we've gotten out of it. And there's no reason at all why this can't continue and spread. And there's no economic reason why it can't go on. Now the reason I emphasize the big magnitude here, the 3,900%, is that then many of the causes, the alleged causes of this, stop making any sense. If you say, I know why there was an industrial revolution and the Great Enrichment, foreign trade. That's what did it, foreign trade. No. Foreign trade makes you better off. I'm an economist. I'm sworn to be in favor of free trade. They'll take away my union card if I start saying, free trade's bad. Free trade is good. But free trade doesn't cause a factor of 30. Let's see. Exploitation. There's another one. If you're a Marxist economist, you say, aha! Aha! I know why the Europeans are rich. The bastards stole it from the third world. Or, still more implausibly, they stole it from their own poor people. Now, somehow, you steal it from the poor people, and everyone, including the poor people, get 30 times richer. It's a little strange. But there's not enough to steal to get a factor of 30. Not even close. If you're going to adopt a life of stealing, would you steal from the homeless people in the neighborhood? Would you steal from a bunch of poor people? If you're going to be a thief, steal from rich people. If you're Britain, don't steal from India. Don't bother with that. There's nothing, you can't make a lot of money stealing from Indians, from South Asians. Instead, steal from, let's see, Germans or French people, right? So there's something desperately wrong with the claim that trade or exploitation caused the great enrichment. Here's one more example. Investment. Say, well, you don't understand investment. You're supposed to be an economist, but you don't get investment. You don't get, McCloskey, you don't get that if you pile brick on brick, people get richer. Look around you. See, nice pictures and seats, they've piled them up, and that makes you rich. But as John Maynard Keynes said, within one generation, if there's no innovation, if there are no new ideas, you can drive the return on the investment down to zero. And if you keep making investments when the return is zero, you're just a fool, right? It's obviously stupid. If the return, the interest rate, the earnings on investment is zero, stop doing it, right? Well, that then points to the answer. The answer is obviously innovation. Now, this is a point that a lot of my economic historians colleagues have come to. It's got to be innovation. Got a crick in my neck, sorry. It's got to be innovation. It has to be new ideas. And if you look around, what's this made of? If you look around, yes, reinforced concrete. One of the great inventions of the 19th century. You take a Roman technology of concrete, you combine it with inexpensive steel, made for the first time in the 19th century. They made steel before, but in small amounts, very expensive, only good for aristocratic swords. You put it together and you can build buildings out of it. This very attractive carpet. I don't mean to be sarcastic, but there it is. I don't think it has any seams. I don't see any at any rate. Anyway, it's some enormous piece of machinery made this carpet and made it cheaply, no, not cheaply, inexpensively, considering its great beauty. Wood, cheaper wood, came out of the invention of the circular saw in the late 18th century. Invention of the bandsaw, you know, that you see those you see them where you cut wood. Bandsaw in the early 19th century. But in order to make the bandsaw, you had to have cheap steel. Cheap, flexible steel that could make a band that goes up and down and cuts through stuff. Electric lights, obviously. And it's not necessarily science. This is a good example. This is a weird example. Dropped ceilings. Take a look at that that's called a dropped ceiling. It's a very simple idea. It's got this chemical stuff that makes the foam panels. I don't know quite what it is. But then it's got steel, not rods exactly, but steel strips to hold the stuff. The advantage of it, of course, is that you can get in there to fix the plumbing, in case it leaks, God, I hope it doesn't, or the air conditioning, or the electricity anytime you want. And yet nobody notices that oh, dropped ceiling. You never notice the dropped ceiling. That's a new idea. And you get thousands, millions of these new ideas, and you get rich. You get rich, and you stay rich. You get new ideas of organization, the corporate form, for example, or the modern research college, research university. Your professors here at Wabash are committed to being teachers, good teachers, but they're also committed to doing research in their field. And this idea of combining teaching and research was invented once. Invented at the University of Berlin in 1810 by a man named von Humboldt. So these organizational and technical and biological ideas kept accumulating, and they didn't, now you have to ask, why did that happen? Did it happen because of investment? Did it happen because piling brick on brick or BA on BA? No. It happened, and here's the conclusion I've come to. This is the killer app, among others. I got all these killer apps. It's so great. If I could only earn some money from them. Here's the killer app idea. The innovation was caused by liberty and dignity for ordinary people. Say that again. Liberty and dignity for ordinary people. What is called, we've screwed up the word in America, but what's called liberalism in Europe. That is the remarkable discovery that was first sort of theorized in the 18th century by people like Adam Smith. I always cross myself when I say Adam Smith. Was kind of theorized by Adam Smith, but then was really shown to be correct in the 19th century, in the 1800s, in places like Wabash, in places like Indiana. And here's what was discovered. Ordinary people, when you leave them alone and honor them, treat them like adults, treat them like not serfs or whatever, you treat them with respect, are amazingly creative. That's what we learned in the 19th century. I mean, they are amazingly creative. I once saw an exhibit at the Wisconsin Historical Society of all the designs for, hear this is really weird, cherry corers. You know, cherries have a pit, cherry pitters. They have to get the pit out. You can't just bite into a cherry, it's not going to work. You have to get the pit out. There were 300 of them. Where did these come from? Well, Wisconsin in the 19th century was a fruit state. It became the cheese state later. It was a fruit state. There were cherry orchards all over the place. And these nutty, ordinary farmers spent the winter trying to figure out how to get the pit out of the cherries. And they made 200 or 300 of these things. All different designs, crazy, throw it up against the wall, turn it upside down and stick a pin through it, blah, 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 blah. They had all these ways of doing it. And that's what we learned. Now, what a lot of intellectuals think we learned in the 19th century was that nationalism is a great thing, that socialism is the wave of the future. Later, we learned that National Socialism, Nazis, that's what it means in German, is a wonderful way to behave. We learned eugenics. Let's get rid of all those common people, those ordinary people. Let's shuffle them off to the gas chambers, and we'll only be left by the best people. We'll only be left with the best people, namely me and my friends. Materialism. All history, according to 19th century theorists, is about matter, about profit, about interest, about money. That's what we learned. All those theories were wrong, and they came to grief. What we really learned was what I just told you, that ordinary people left to themselves and respected are incredibly creative. And this lesson applies to any country in the world. If Nigeria wants to grow faster than it is now, and it better, it's a terrible mess right now, it's got to leave people alone, stop stealing from them. Thief, thief is the big joke in Nigeria. And not sneer at them. It's got to let them go. Have a go is how the English express it. English. Have a go. And having a go hadn't been allowed beforehand. You were fixed in one position. You, if you lived, the guy in the back row, if you lived in 1600, you grew up in one position and you stayed there. And mostly you stayed with poor people because that was 90% of the people. And you never got anywhere. You were someone's man, someone's woman, and that was it. No more talk of having a go. That changed. Why did it change? It didn't change because of foreign trade or investment or any of the materialist explanations, nor was it changed because of improved property rights, as my friend Doug North has claimed. That's nonsense. Property rights were very good in China and Japan, the Ottoman Empire, yet they didn't have this great enrichment. And indeed, in 1492, any sensible person, if they could have imagined an industrial revolution and then really this great enrichment that came after it, if they could have thought of such a thing, they would have expected China to have it, not Europeans, these nitwits in one corner of Eurasia who fought with each other all the time and killed each other in great numbers and went on crusades at the drop of a hat. These are not people who were going to succeed economically, yet they did. It was northwestern Europe. It started in Holland, went to England in around 1700, went to what became the United States, Scotland, then Belgium, northern France, the Rhineland, etc. Now, why did this happen? It happened not because Europeans are superior to everyone else, not because Dutch people are smarter than everyone else, not because English people are so wonderful. It happened, so to speak, by accident. By accident. The accidents of egalitarian politics in Europe in the 1500s and 1600s and 1700s. Things like the Reformation, Protestant Reformation. Not the way Max Weber argued in 1905, the Protestant ethic, but because in what's called the Radical Reformation, Anabaptists, eventually English Quakers, church or Congregationalists, as in New England, church governance was democratic. You chose your own minister. Now, this is a radical idea. The idea that you could choose your own priest was just nuts in 1500. And yet it became a theme in Protestant Europe, at least part of Protestant Europe. Not among my people, the Anglicans, the Episcopalians, not among the Lutherans, who still had bishops appointed partly by the king, but in the radical edge of the Reformation. And then there were revolutions, civil wars, that happened to go in an egalitarian direction. This direction of allowing people to have a go and giving them dignity. For example, the English Civil War, in which English people brought a king to a court and convicted him and cut off his head. This shocked all of Europe. It wasn't that it was unusual for kings to be killed. I mean, that was rather commonplace. But that they were killed by trial was what was shocking. And then for a while, England didn't have any kings. And this was shocking and made people bold. In the same way in Holland, which I regard as the seedbed of all this, the Dutch got rid of their Spanish overlord. It took them a long time, 80 years. Meanwhile, they were having tremendous economic success and artistic success, for that matter. And they were a republic, the Dutch Republic, no kings. They had elected stadhouders, city holders, it means. Like, it doesn't matter who it was, but they were elected chief executives, not inherited chief executives. So the whole idea of an aristocratic society depending on a king was set aside in Holland. And so it went. By accident, we got this liberty and dignity that makes the modern world. Everyone here is equal to me by conviction, by political and social decision. I need to treat each of you as free and dignified. You're not slaves. You're not to be condemned. You're not. I can't be contemptuous of you. Not just because I'll lose my job as a teacher, but because that's the deal. In fact, and here I'll end. There's a deal which I call the bourgeois deal. You know, this word bourgeois, I like this word. Middle class, the bourgeois deal. You let me, a bourgeois, innovate. We talk in economics about creative destruction. Look, it happens in music all the time. We invent some new way of making music that sounds like a plane crash. To me, it sounds like a plane crash. You think it's music, I don't. But let's not argue about it. You make a new plane crash sound, and the other plane crash sounds go out of style. So you've creatively destroyed the earlier. A nice example, or not so nice example, I think about in jazz, is what's his name? I'm going to forget his name. Charlie Bird Parker, who invented a new way of playing the saxophone and a new way of doing jazz that made obsolete swing music. And thousands of swing musicians were out of a job because of Charlie Parker and his friends. So it happens in the arts, it happens in journalism, it happens in scholarship, it happens in science, but I'm telling you it happens in the economy. The economy is subject to this creative destruction, and when it is, we do very well. As I said, I call it the bourgeois deal. You let me, a bourgeois, innovate. Try something new. If it doesn't work, I pay. I lose out. I go bankrupt. But if it works, I make a lot of money. Nothing wrong with that, since you're better off too. And here's the deal. You let me do this, and I'll make you all rich. That's the capitalist deal. I hate the word capitalist. Well, you want to go into that if you want. But it's the bourgeois deal. You let me do this creative destruction, unique to the modern world, this fantastic explosion of creativity from ordinary people allowed to have a go, and I'll make you all rich. And she did. So that's my story. You can't explain it with ordinary economics. Let me do one diagram. I mean, I'm an economist. I love diagrams. So let me do a diagram. Here it is. Suppose we have, I don't know, labor and the marginal product of labor, downward sloping, and a supply curve of labor like that. Supply, demand. Okay? You've all seen this in Ec 1. And suppose there's a screw up and we end up here. If we fix the screw up, we improve things by that so-called Harburger triangle. Nice. It's what we teach in price theory, in microeconomics. But here's what actually happened in the last 2 centuries. And it's got nothing to do with the supply and demand curve diagram, or very little to do with it. The supply curve moved out to, well, here. Probably a little further, out there in the quad somewhere. And since the supply curve moved out, people's incomes grew up, and so the demand curve moved out too. So the whole system, whoosh, that's the whoosh part, zoomed out. And that zooming out is not something that conventional economics explains. Austrian economics has a much better chance, if you want to know my actual belief in this. But conventional, what I call Samsonian economics, hasn't got a chance of explaining this. It's the most important secular event in human history since the invention of agriculture. And economists, most of them, have no explanation of it. So, they don't, but I do. Thank you very much. So, I'll sit down. I'm very old, so I'll sit down and I'll respond to questions. Yes?
So, explain to me how this particular theory, which you say, you know, the elements of it first show up in the Netherlands.
Yeah.
How it explains that the takeoff actually happens in England.
Well, it didn't happen only in England. It happened also in what became the United States.
A bit later.
But now, in some, yeah, a little bit. But it happened in Holland. But then the Dutch grew sclerotic, and the regenta, the regent class, grew proud, and they specialized in banking and foreign trade, instead of continuing these industrial developments. But that's only the same as southern and eastern England. They too, during the 18th and 19th century, didn't invent anything. They too, now I'm not talking about Birmingham or Manchester, talking about London or Norfolk. They too specialized in saving, investing, merchant activities. So I don't think there's some deep Dutch failure. But a little bit later, the southern Netherlands, the southern Low Countries, namely what's now Belgium, start developing very smartly. Now, it's screwed up a bit by the Napoleonic Wars. But had there not been the Napoleonic Wars, Belgium would have started industrializing earlier. So, again, in the longer view of history, when we're looking back on this episode 1,000 years from now, we won't be so worried about why England. Because 1,000 years from now, we'll notice this wonderful enrichment of the entire world. It turned out the English trick, if it was anything peculiarly English, was remarkably easy to imitate. And that's what happened.
I ask only by contrast. I mean, I agree with you that there are essentially 3 revolutions in human history. The first is creation of our own sort of cognitive linguistic.
That's right, brain.
Second is agriculture, third is industry.
That's right.
But the difference between industry and agriculture is that, as you pointed out, agriculture was spontaneously invented separately 7 to 9 different times across the
Right.
globe. And industry only comes once. Now, maybe that's because once it's invented in the modern world, there's enough network connections that it can't be invented independently, essentially.
Yeah, except that's true. I think that what you say is correct. Yet, industrial revolutions, I've come recently to realize, are rather common in human history. That is, the Roman Empire under the good emperors was a reasonably innovative economy. But it's the order of magnitude that's not the same. So I'm less focused on the Industrial Revolution. That's where I started, trying to figure out the Industrial Revolution. But then I've slowly realized, wait a second, Song China, as I told you, and blah, blah, they were having pretty much the same thing, but what they didn't have was the second step, namely the Great Enrichment, when ordinary people's incomes were transformed. And that really didn't start happening until the second half of the 19th century. And then it's gone completely wild since then.
Except that by for most of the world, except that by 1850, England is a good 50 times richer per capita than any place else.
No, not even close. It's 20% richer. It's 30% richer. It may be double. It's going on $6 a day, $8 a day, maybe. It's not the case that the Industrial Revolution transformed the condition of the working class in England. This is a long dispute between the left and the right in economic history, and I'm beginning to think that the left is right, so to speak. But their point is irrelevant. I mean, yes, the Industrial Revolution didn't do it. It was the Great Enrichment, the follow-on, that did it. So it's very important to get these magnitudes correct, that the Industrial Revolution is a rather modest increase in income that we're talking about. Doubling, maybe. Doesn't sound like modest, but it is modest by comparison to what came later. And it's what came later that made this institution possible. Your grandparents, your great-grandparents, your great-great-grandparents were very poor. Let me have a show of hands. How many people in this room had let's see, how many greats should I put on? Say, great-great-grandparents who were very poor working-class people? Put your hands up. Yeah, well, what did I say? And now look at you. Not by historical or international standards. As you know, as he's an economic historian too, we're fantastically rich. Yes, dear?
Why bourgeois or other classes? Why that? Why middle class, you said, right? Bourgeois values, bourgeois. Why the creativity there?
Well, because that's where it's going to be in a capitalist society. Here I agree with Marx and Engels, that the bourgeoisie has created more productive forces in the last 100 years than all other societies combined, blah, blah, blah. They saw that very clearly. And their insistence on the word bourgeois, I'm accepting. Now, I'm a free market person, understand that. I was once a Marxist. When I was a kid, I was a Marxist, but I got over it. And I'm saying that we supporters of free societies, as the person we honor tonight certainly was, Ben Rogge, we've got to claim back this word. It's a perfectly good word. It means middle class. It means townsperson in French. So Burger in Dutch or Burger in German. But you're right. Understand that I'm emphasizing ordinary people. Ordinary people get into the bourgeoisie if they invent something that does well. Samuel Arkwright invented a spinning machine. He was a barber. His father was a tailor. He ended his life, he died in 1792 among the richest commoners in England. Sir Samuel, he was by then. Well, that's a working class person, becomes bourgeois and then part of the aristocracy. Yes?
So if your model explains the past fairly well, does it fail sort of in modern times and then towards the future as specialization or as innovation becomes more specialized?
Well, that's a view that the great economist Joseph Schumpeter held, that innovation had become routinized, that the great industrial laboratories were where innovation would take place in future. I don't think that's happened. I think Schumpeter was wrong on this, as on many things. But that's about the front line of innovation, right? Getting new computers and new spaceships and so on. That's way out on the frontier. You see what I'm saying? What's really enriching the world is applying what we already know to places like China and India and sub-Saharan Africa, right? No one would have to innovate for another 100 years. Anything. You could have a completely stagnant, innovative sector. And yet, places like China, India, sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America could grow at gigantic rates, as they have, by simply using the technology we already have correctly. I mean, if you had Mao or the Gandhis screwing up your economy, and then you let people have a go and don't steal from them and treat them with respect, then you get applications of automobiles and textiles and so on. But there are some people, some of my economist colleagues, think that we've run out of innovations. But on that, I have to keep pointing out to them that so we have thought before. There was a theory about it that Keynes and Alvin Hansen and lots of others subscribed to in the 1940s called stagnationism. Sounds pretty scary. And it turned out to be complete nonsense. Yeah. Speak up so everyone can hear.
Oh, yeah. So you mentioned the great enrichment and
Yeah.
how innovation shaped it and conventional econ could not describe it.
Yeah, see these curves moving out.
Yeah. So to what extent do you think entrepreneurship contributed towards the great enrichment?
Well, entrepreneurship's my whole story. That's what Schumpeter got right. He got it right very early. He wrote a book in 1911 called Economic Development. And in that, he talked about entrepreneurship, and then he started to wander off and got a whole bunch of things wrong. But that he got right. Entrepreneurship, I mentioned the Austrian economists, and one I particularly admire is Israel Kirzner, someone who everyone here ought to read. He's a very interesting guy. He's a rabbi, by the way, as well as a professor of economics, and he's very important in American Judaism. Israel is. He's a great rabbi, as well as being a great economist. But anyway, he emphasizes entrepreneurship, and so does the Austrian group generally. And that's what I mean. But, and this is crucial, it's not because psychology changes that we got the modern world. That's the big mistake that the entrepreneurial school makes. It says, well, it's got to be entrepreneurship that explains innovation. So let's see. Well, we must have more of these innovative people around. That must be what it is. No. That's Max Weber, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. It's wrong. What changed was the attitude of the economy towards entrepreneurs. Crucial. Because everyone here has a little entrepreneur in him or her. Everyone here has the potential, if you let it, to open a new hairdressing salon or start a new business or think of a new way of doing stuff. Everyone here does. Humans are very creative, it turns out. But if the society says, no, don't create, the very word innovation was a bad word until the 19th century, until the 1800s. Innovation was dangerous. Oh, you're going to change the words of the mass. You're going to offend God. Oh no, don't do innovation. No, that'll disturb things. The great chain of being will get out of whack. You see a lot of this in Shakespeare. He talks this way all the time. Coriolanus, for example, but there are many, many other examples. So it's not just holding out entrepreneurship doesn't do it. It's the sociological change that makes every one of you into an entrepreneur. That's the difference. That's capable of making a modern world. Where if we had to depend on a bunch of geniuses and we couldn't, we had to just breed more of them, we wouldn't have this enormous increase. Again, this magnitude's important. Factor of 30. Yeah.
What role do you think the stock market plays? Do you think it's a critical one-time innovation, or is it just more in this endless stream of stuff that's been going on?
I'm not sure it's critical, but it's quite important, and I'm not against the stock market as many naive people are. More generally, I'm not against financial innovation. My brother is poor, and he was able to buy a house in 2006 because of these deals that the bankers were making, giving mortgages and then selling the mortgages in chopped up form to Icelanders. So it's not all bad. My poor brother was able to buy a house. So the stock market is it's not an infallible test of everything, but it's a useful.
But it's curious that it was invented by the Dutch, and it's curious how it kind of aggregates all of these little pieces of
That's right.
Pieces of capital that are from all of these ordinary citizens, and then allocates investment.
That's right. That's right. I agree. That's what stock markets do. That's what bond markets do, for that matter. But yeah, I agree. And I in fact, one of my stories is very conventional, which not a discovery of mine, which is that the Dutch, who, as I was saying before, invented a lot of this stuff and started doing it in the late 1500s and then all through the 1600s. The English fought 3 wars with the Dutch and kept having trouble beating this little country with its admirals Tromp and so on, who didn't turn out to be pushovers. And finally, my joke is, finally the English said, oh, to hell with it, we'll become Dutch. And they adopted a Dutch king. I'm not making this up, they did. They allowed him to invade their country and celebrate it and said, oh, he didn't invade, we just decided to have him. he invaded the country successfully. Then they adopted a Dutch stock market, a Dutch central bank, and most of all, a Dutch national debt. And then they were able to fight the French more or less continuously for 120 years because they could keep going and borrowing, actually in the bond market, gathering the savings from all over the world, but especially from Britain, to attack the French. So these but that's what that's what Schumpeter got wrong. In the 1930s, he was touting financial innovations as the key to the modern world, and I just don't think it is. I don't think they're inconsequential, but I don't think they're the key. The key is just the whole system of innovation, letting people have a go. Yeah.
So then do you think that this cultural acceptance to innovation was more important than the institutional fact that, like, more people had money and could demand a greater variety of goods, and so there was creating more unique things, or are they together?
I think that the demands that poor people put, let's take an example. What caused the 8-hour day? Now, if you ask my friends in history, my left-wing friends, and I love them, they're very good historians, what caused the 8-hour day? They'll say it's trade unions caused the 8-hour day, or a great national agitation for the 8-hour day. But what actually caused the 8-hour day is just as you said. Workers became better off and didn't want to work 12 hours a day, thank you very much. They were willing to work 8 and were willing to get paid for it, but they're not going to work 10, 12 hours a day. What was the first part of your question?
Oh, it's just, do you think the cultural acceptance to innovation is more important than?
Well, yeah, it's the initiating cause. The cultural acceptance of innovation, it's a nice way to put it. But it changes, see, it's not deep cultural. It's not something that Europeans have all the time. They didn't. They were very hostile to innovation for a long time. No, it changed in the 16th and 17th century, 18th, and then exploded in the 19th. And that's what made ordinary people rich and allowed them to insist on, I wouldn't say demand, that's to confuse the issue, but insist on things like the 8-hour day or more variety in consumption, as you said. Yes?
So why was there this change in attitudes? Why was there
I gave you some hints in that. I talked about the Protestant Reformation. I talked about the successful revolts and revolutions. I call them the 4 R's. And a crucial R is reading. A crucial R is the so-called invention of the printing press. Now, the printing press was actually invented in China hundreds of years earlier. So this is part of this European nonsense that everything important comes out of Europe. It didn't. But reading had a tremendous influence on the dignity with which people viewed themselves and others. It made possible the Reformation. In the first week of Martin Luther's address to the nobility of the German nation, he had 4,000 copies printed. The next week, another 4,000. Within 2 weeks, there were 8,000 of this inflammatory pamphlet against the Pope, who was, the ruler of Christianity. That was impossible half a century or 100 years earlier, which is why earlier attempts of the Church of Faith to overturn the Church of Power hadn't worked. So that's one source of it. So reading, Reformation, revolt, the Dutch revolt against Spain, and revolution. The English Civil War, you could call it the English Revolution, the American Revolution, the French Revolution. Successful revolutions against the hierarchy, against the great chain of being. Now, there were revolutions elsewhere. In Japan, for example, even under the Tokugawa, was racked with rural riots broke out all the time. But there was no big challenge to the hierarchical nature of Japanese society. Whereas this stuff did challenge by accident, not because of some deep European superiority, but by accident, resulted in, I hear it again, legal freedom, social dignity. Those two. Yeah.
I want to know, like, when you mentioned...
Speak up, they can't hear you. Louder, just be loud.
When you mentioned that the Great Enrichment was not completely because of international trade.
No, not at all because of international
So
trade.
do you think the Dutch East Indian Company, the first multinational company, did that have anything to do with the Dutch Great Enrichment?
No, it didn't. It was a interesting, bring back my Dutch, I won't try, the VOC, we say in Dutch, the VOC, Oost-Indisch Company, was interesting, but not a big deal, frankly. In fact, imperialism in general was not a big deal. We're inclined to think that since it was so interesting to people at the time and so fascinating to historians who didn't know much economics afterwards, imperialism must have been really important. This is the big mistake. I was talking to some students earlier about this. This is the big mistake that Jared Diamond makes in his brilliant book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. He said he's got this wonderful argument that explains why the Great Enrichment had to happen in Eurasia. It wasn't going to happen in Africa or North and South America. And then he goes completely off on a tangent and starts talking about conquest. Conquest didn't make the Europeans rich. Imperialism was a waste of money. Now, it was insulting to the Indians, South Asians, or the Africans, or the Native Americans. It was irritating and insulting to them, but the hurt from imperialism is not the same as gain to ordinary Europeans. Just think of it. Suppose you rob a convenience store. I don't recommend it. But suppose you rob a convenience store and you accidentally kill the clerk. You didn't intend to, but you do. You got $36.27 from the robbery. Now wait a second. Is his death a gain to you? No, it's not. And that's what imperialism is like. It's of no bloody use to the ordinary people. A few people got rich on imperialism. How wonderful. A few twits from minor public schools went to serve in the empire. Okay, big deal. It didn't make ordinary Cockneys and Yorkshiremen and Scots any better off. What made them better off was indoor plumbing, dropped ceilings, internal combustion engine, electric lights, central heating, penicillin. Yeah, well, let me go to her first and then to you.
Do we need to worry about sustainability? So kind of two questions. Is this model of innovation and global enrichment a sustainable model? And the other side of it is our worry about sustainability a potential problem for this global innovation?
The worry about sustainability is very dangerous because it takes irrational forms. And it is coming down from Chicago to here. You, of course, go through this big wind farm, right? Well, they're very nice, and that's very wonderful. But you know, they're all subsidized. There wouldn't be a single one if it were not for government programs. They're not they're not economically sustainable right now. Now, maybe in future they will be, and the Danes are very important in this industry, and maybe they'll get it cheaper, and maybe it'll work out all right. But the wider question of sustainability is, I'm optimistic, and the reason I'm optimistic is that we've been very good about fixing environmental problems when they come to our attention, when we get worried about them. When I was a kid, we still burned coal for heat in houses. I can remember my father going down to stoke the furnace that heated our apartment every morning to make it so he wouldn't freeze during the day on a cold day. And he had to bank it during the night so it didn't go out. So you had to be kind of a fireman in the railway sense. His father was a freight conductor, so I guess he came by it naturally. But anyway, that caused, of course, terrible pollution. And here's a nice fact, fun facts from economic history. The east side of every city in the northern hemisphere is the slum. Why is that? Because the prevailing wind is from the west. So the east side is where the coal smoke from heating the houses dropped. Whereas people on the west side got the fresh air from the countryside. And this proves it's true in Vienna, it's true in Paris, it's true in London, it's true in Boston. It can't quite work because the ocean is there, but it works, it works, it works, it works. Then we did something about it. And we stopped burning soft coal for heat. And the ozone layer, right? The hole in the Antarctic ozone layer growing. What a catastrophe. From hairspray. Now, I'm a big hairspray. I haven't got enough for actually on right now, but I'm a big hairspray. Turns out that Margaret Thatcher, who was a big consumer of hairspray, was one of the big supporters of doing something about the hole in the ozone layer. If we didn't do anything about it, we'd all get cancer and die. The human race would be exterminated. So we did something about it. So I'm optimistic. I think that we can figure this out. Yeah. Go ahead.
So, a sort of theory of history question. And thinking of your article about differential equations and so forth. One might hear your argument as a sort of reducing the explanation to sort of monocausal.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, it is.
Right.
Monocausal. Moi.
How do you, so, right. So most historians.
I know, they don't like monocausal.
And I think for good reason.
No, I don't think.
Because multiple causes and contexts and so forth.
Well, contexts matter.
Always matter.
Yeah.
How do you, I'll change, I have to change the questions later. How do you justify the validity of a monocausal explanation?
Well,
it would seem that your monocause has deeper roots and much more complex context.
well, but I've given you, in response to what I said over there, I've given you some of the context. Volume 3, put your orders in early, because it's going to be a hot seller, I'm telling you. Volume 3 goes into some of this deeper context for the change in innovation. But I think that as historians, we should look for monocauses if they're there. If they're not there, then we should stop looking for them. But I don't think there's some methodological proposition that says all explanations in history should be multi-causal. I just don't get it. That's not true in physics. I don't see why it would be true in history. That if let's take a case. It's a little hard to think of one. Well, what was the cause of the abolition of slavery in the United States? Well, it was the Civil War, wasn't it? That's pretty obvious. That without the Civil War, slavery would have persisted in the United States as it did in Brazil for 20 years after the American Civil War. So, my great-great-grandfather, who fought in an Indiana regiment, had to go to war. And that's monocausal. Or, I don't see why we can't. Now, I agree with your wider point that as historians, we've got to constantly ask, what's the context? What makes this possible in this circumstance when it wasn't in another? And I think the great discipline in thinking about economic growth is China. If we don't constantly compare Western Europe with China, we're not doing our job as explaining economic growth, because China had every advantage. It had peace, it had high technology, most innovations up to really the 17th century were Chinese. We used to think that the blast furnace was invented by Swedes. No, it wasn't. It was invented by Chinese. This is Joseph Needham's great works.
So what do you think of Ken Pomerantz's great divergence?
Well, I think Ken's right. There was a great divergence, but now there's a great convergence. I think there's no question about it. And I don't think there's any divergence that's going to last forever. Because I don't think Ken believes that it's going to last forever either. Although Ken's interesting, because he did a book with a colleague when he was at Irvine. I forget his name, but anyway. No, not Ben Wong.
The
trade book. And this was a series of columns that Ken and this other guy did for some magazine. And they're very neat because they're little pieces of economic history. But what's extremely striking about the book is that nowhere is modern economic growth mentioned. Nowhere in an account of the economic world from, say, the 1500s to the present does this very good historian, Ken Pomerantz, he's a sinologist, mention the most important secular event in human history since the invention of agriculture. And this is really the problem on the left. Ken is a man of the left. And the problem on the left is that they don't want to admit that poor people were made better off by the modern world. It just irritates them. They're just annoyed. No, this capitalism is terrible. It can't be good for poor people. But, Ken, it has been. Everyone here is the descendant of poor people. And yet here we are discussing economic philosophy and the history of the world since the beginning of an evening. Our ancestors didn't have time for this stuff. They couldn't get educated. They could barely get their food together for tomorrow. Praise the Lord for the bourgeois deal.
It's probably a good place to end our formal